That being said, let's get started. So after a couple of very difficult weeks here in Israel, after a year and a half of difficult weeks here in Israel, I thought we would review a really important topic. And it comes from a couple places. One, the incredible resolve and the incredible basically wonder that is everyday life in Israel. I don't think it gets credit enough amid all the drama and headlines and everything else, but the everyday life here in Israel is pretty miraculous. And the resolve that people have and the diversity, and despite or because of the diversity, how well people by and large get along with each other. And it reminds me of a story that happened here with Cafe Oleh when we first started out um, just over 7 years ago in the then Nefesh B'Nefesh office in Tel Aviv, when it used to be on Sderot Rothschild on Rothschild Boulevard. And I was teaching in person, and there was a dry erase board, and we were talking about words um, that many people would define as quote unquote bad words, right? Words you're not supposed to use in public, but you nonetheless know if not use yourselves. And one of the participants got really upset with me and said, I don't like that we're learning these words. And I said, I can understand that. But first off, this was a request from your fellow participants. And second, whether you like these words or not, whether you're going to use these words or not, you're going to hear these words. What you decide to do with them is totally up to you. I'm teaching you not just modern Hebrew, but how it works in what we call Israeli society and what is Israeli identity and culture. You decide how you want to use them. Much like in your respective countries of origin, there are bad words. They're not just expletives, they're how we describe one another. Some of you may use them. Some of you may say nothing when other people say them, and others of you may correct people. Whatever your walk of life is, today we're going to do a review of what those words are, both positive ways to identify ourselves and each other, and then the words you should really not use anymore. Some of these are generational. Some of these are our own biases and sensitivities. I know certainly as a North American, I am more sensitive to certain words than others, but I also know that certain words are simply outdated. Certain generations use some words that others don't. And we're going to go through some of those as well. I'm teaching you them to know what they are. I'm not teaching you for you to automatically go out and use them on the street. And you're going to see that in big letters in English to ensure you get the difference between that. Um, and the gradations, the nuances of the other words that we're going to learn. Okay, so with that, let's get started. As always, the spreadsheet I'm going to share with you, you'll be getting as an attachment along with a recording of this email. You're also welcome to old school pen and paper, screenshot, or just sit back and watch. Any of our other previous lessons are up on YouTube, as I said. So let's get started first and foremost. So when we talk about how do we talk about each other and ourselves, right? Identities and communities. We have a lot of different words and a lot of different ways to explain who we are and what we are. And one of these is something that we've done before and we've done multiple times, and we're going to review again and again because it's so important in modern Hebrew is how do you take a word, a noun, and turn it into an adjective? Just like in English, right? We have all those endings, ish, esk, an, ease, all those different endings. In Hebrew, it's very easy, and you're going to see a number of these have to do with identities. So for example, the first one here, when you see all these in the Hebrew, right here in column C, those dashes mean there's a word there, that's the noun we're talking about, and those suffixes, the letters we add at the end of them, correspond to gender and plurality. So for example, if I take the word Brit, short for Britannia, right? Britain, and I turn it into Briti, right? Briti, that is British. In that case, British can refer both to a person and a thing. So for example, as you see here under those suffixes, Gever Briti is a British man. If I add Yud Yud Hey, which is how I would write it without nikud, without the dots and bars indicating vowel sounds, it would be female, either person or thing. So in the case of Gilmania, right, the country Germany, Isha Gilmania, a German woman. Okay, it's as simple as that. Ia, iim, iot. Just add that dash there again. Okay. This is one way to do nationalities, to assign a nationality to something, a person and or thing. Some of them go slightly different. They take the ai ending, ai, ait, aiim, aiot. These are typically words that end with a vowel, such as Amerikai, Tunisai, American, Tunisian, right? Amerikai, Amerikait, Amerikaim, Amerikaiot, referring to American people, just like Tunisai, Tunisite, Tunisaim, Tunisaiot, things or people, Tunisian. Okay, this is another way to do it. By the way, this ending, as you see here, also has to do with professions. For example, an itonai is someone who works on a iton. Iton is the modern Hebrew word for newspaper. Itonai, a journalist. Okay, itonai, male journalist. Itonait, female journalist. Another way we can do this is taking the ending ist or yst from English and transliterating it into Hebrew, into ist, right? Analyst. Analyst is an analyst. Guitaristit, a female guitarist, right? All we have to do is add that ist to the end of a word, and we've come up with someone who's an ist, is a belonging to that, or they use that on a regular basis, right? The diminutive. Diminutive is the fancy word for making something small. A lot of different languages have that. Those of you who are familiar with Spanish, for example, you know the endings ito or ita make something smaller, not just in size, but also in relation, maybe age, and so forth. Same thing in Hebrew. If you add the ending on, male, or onet, female, you make something smaller. So a yalda is a girl. A yaldonet, as you see here, is a small girl. Okay. Yalda, yaldonet. That ending changes her identity from a girl to a small girl. By the way, small there again doesn't necessarily mean size. It can also mean age. It can also mean like how you would say that as a term of endearment, like cute little girl. That's going to come back into words you absolutely don't use in a little bit. Okay. The ending nun or nit or nim or niot, as you see here with all the different suffixes, also has to do with professions. Kalkalan. If kalkala is the word for economy, a kalkalan, economist. A mishpatanit. Mishpat is law. So a mishpatanit is a female jurist. Okay. And then finally, identity through profession or location. And this is a loan, just like we had East, which is a loan from English, we have Nik. Nik is a loan from Slavic languages that refers to someone who belongs to something, right? So for example, the classic one, a kibbutznik, right? A kibbutznik is a slang term for someone who lives and belongs to a kibbutz. The proper term in modern Hebrew would be a chaver or a chavrat kibbutz, but you can simply say a kibbutznik or a kibbutznikit. Okay. A jobnik is slang for someone who does their army service in an office, right? It's a job, a job. Okay. You can also call people all sorts of other things. For example, um, uh, a couple terms I use, and I've also heard other people use, is a chulnik. A chulnik is someone from chul, from abroad, meaning a tourist or a student or someone who doesn't live here full time and isn't an Israeli citizen because they're from chul, or an irnik. I, for example, am an irnik. I am not only a city dweller, always lived in a city. Ir nik. Ir is the word for a city. We're going to go through in a little bit. Nik, again, that suffix indicating connected to. or identity through. Why do I start with these? Because a lot of the words that we use to describe ourselves and each other in modern Hebrew, for good and not good, follow these rules, have these suffixes at the end. You've probably heard them before, right? Think of all the time, all the last 2, 3 years, or many years before that, slang terms, disparaging terms, but also positive terms, all had these endings if they were describing someone based on these various traits. Okay, there's plenty of others, but this is one way we can use this just in everyday life, but also in identifying ourselves and each other. Let's get to some other ways. How do we identify? First off, the word for majority is rov, right? For many of us, this is the first time in our lives we live in a um, country, in a city, in a community, in a neighborhood, but in a city or in a country where harov hu Yehudi, where the majority is Jewish. Okay, that's one of the defining things that separates diaspora in Israel, that the majority here are Jewish. Okay, the opposite of rov is miut. Okay, miut is a minority. That can be a minority of opinions, but that can also be minority in identity, right? Bechul, in abroad, Yehudim hem miut. Jews are a minority. Okay, that's the difference. Ways we identify ourselves is migdal. Migdal is the Hebrew word for gender. Okay, I'm not going to get into that here, but that's the word we use, one of the ways. Another way that are specific to Israeli society, and I'm going to explain it just as it says here on the left-hand side, are the terms migzal and eda. So first off, don't get confused between migdal and migzal. They're two different words spelled two different ways. Remember, in Hebrew, spelling is destiny, and every shoresh, every three-letter root of a word is half its meaning. So the shoresh of migdal is gimel daled resh, and the shoresh for migzal is gimel zayin resh. Okay, two entirely different words. Very important. The moment there's any deviation in the order of letters in the shoresh, you know it's a completely different shoresh. In this case, migzal. Migzal in everyday language in Hebrew means sector. But when we talk about identity and we use the term migzal, we're only referring in Hebrew usually to two populations. Hamigzal ha'aravi, or Hamigzal HaCharedi. That's how you're going to hear it in the news. Don't come after me and say, Jay, that's wrong and da da da. Remember how I prefaced the beginning of this class, folks. I'm teaching you words. You may not like these words, but you're going to hear them all the time. Telling you how to approach and showing you what Israeli society is isn't necessarily condoning or condemning it. I'm just presenting it for you. You make your choice. But if you turn on mainstream news in Israel in the Hebrew language, they're going to use the term Hamigzah HaCharedi or Hamigzah HaAravi, literally the Haredi sector or the Arab sector. Those are two very, very broad terms to define a large swath of Israel's populations that in and of themselves have much more diversity. But in talking about them, because they're such big sectors, we use the term migzal. Okay, and it's usually only referring to those two populations. And we're going to talk a little bit more about them in a little bit, those two respectively, because they are so large. Okay, so a second. The other word we use when we describe different identities based on who we are is eda. Eda is a word that already comes in the Torah. Many of you belong to synagogues that have this word eda, or probably some form of the word adith or addis. Those are the names of two of the synagogues my immediate and extended family belong to in the States, right? But in modern Hebrew, the word is eda. And eda we can think of as a community, but in modern Hebrew, we also refer to it as an ethnic group. And in this respect, this is an interesting word. We only use this word when we're talking about a group of people so much as it's Jewish communities and the Druze. We say Ha'edah HaDruzit. We do not say Hamigzar HaDruzit. We say Ha'edah HaDruzit. And we say Edah depending on a Jewish and Israeli Jews background. And we're going to go through some of those in a little bit. Okay, so that's the difference between these two words. We can translate them differently, sector and ethnic group, but know they refer to very specific parts of Israeli population. Hamigzar ha'aravi is a very large swath of nearly 20% of the population. And Hamigzar ha'charedi is also a big swath of the population. Within those, there's a lot more diversity, but we call it in a big, broad stroke, those terms. And then when we get to smaller ones, ha'edah hadruzit, and ha'edah ha, and then you fill in the blank of a diaspora Jewish community with presence in Israel. That edah word also comes up in a negative sense. We have a term in Israeli sociology, anthropology, everyday talk called hashed ha'edati or hashed ha'adati, right? Shed is the Hebrew word for a demon. It's a ghost, but it's a bad ghost. So think the word demon. And hashed ha'adati is, as I wrote here, a term used to describe an argument on the basis of one's origin in diaspora, meaning when you invoke your own or someone else's diasporic origins in Israeli politics, in Israeli society, you're using it in oftentimes talking about honest things that happen in Israeli society or predating the state of Israel, but you're specifically leaning on your diaspora ethnicity to make an argument. And the idea, on the one hand, is that Israel is meant to bring together all the different edot together and to create something new, or at least have them all together. And the reality is sometimes that doesn't happen, and sometimes it can be quite often. And this idea of Hasheda Adati, as much as many people don't want to refer to it, don't want us to keep referring to ourselves based on where we came from before we came to Israel, it does persist, whether we use that term or not. Okay. Other ways we define ourselves is by motza. Motza means origin. Okay. And that's a term that we often use a lot when we talk about different olim, and we'll talk about olim, of course. This is nefesh b'nefesh after all. Where they're from, and that's more of a physical or national aspect, not just ethnic. Okay. Nitiyah is an orientation or affiliation. And just like that, we also, as I said, some of these words are not going to be nice. Kinui gnai. Milat gnai or kinui gnai is a slur, a pejorative, or derogatory way to refer to someone. And in general, the word for coarse or vulgar is gas. Excuse me. Those of you who are cooks, and you have gone grocery shopping in Israel, and you've wondered why are there two types of salt, right? There's melach shulchan and there's melach gas, right? Melach gas, coarse salt, right? The closest thing in we would call in other countries kosher salt. Ironically, we don't have kosher salt in Israel. All of it's kosher. Kosher refers to the size of the granule of salt, not whether it was kosher or not. Okay. Gas, coarse, or vulgar. That can refer to salt. That can refer to someone's behavior or someone's words. Let's look at some other ways we can define ourselves and each other. The word yelid, yelidat for female is born, blank born, or native of blank. So for example, ani yelid Artzot Habrit, right? I'm a native of the United States. I'm not a Native American. That's not what that means. It means that I was born in the United States. Okay. If someone is born in the state of Israel, Yelid Yisrael. Okay. Israeli, Israeli. Always important to point out to my fellow Olim folks, whether you were born here or not, if you made Aliyah, you are Israeli. Full stop. You have the same rights, obligations, and paperwork as anyone who was born here, no matter how soon or how far in the past you made Aliyah, you are Israeli. What you may not be, if you are an Oleh or an Olah, is a Tzabar. Tzabar is a slang term, a nickname for someone who is a Yelid Israel or Yelid Haaretz, someone who is born in the state of Israel, right? Tzabar is the Hebrew word for the prickly pear, which, by the way, is not native to this neck of the woods. It's originally from Mexico. If you've ever seen the Mexican flag, look very carefully again. Even if you've seen it multiple times, that thing in there is a tzabar. Tzabar is the Hebrew word for sabra, prickly pear. The idea being the myth of Israelis are prickly on the outside and sweet and mushy on the inside. I think hopefully we have gone past that myth. If not, please join me for my future class on emotional awareness, because that myth is, yeah. But anyways, Sabah is grown here in Israel. It was introduced after the Europeans entering the New World and bringing it back, which is why it's so prevalent, not just here, but throughout the Mediterranean, where it grows quite a lot. Okay. A Jewish immigrant to the state of Israel is an Oleh, masculine Oleh, feminine Olah, plural Olim, plural feminine Olot. Simple as that. An Oleh is absolutely a Yisraeli. They're just not a Tzabar. Simple as that. Okay. Oleh Chadash, Olah Chadasha, a new Jewish immigrant. We use this term a lot. It does have a cap. It does have a expiration date on it. I'm not sure what that is, but I can tell you, being here now close to 19 years, I am definitely not an Oleh Chadash. That has nothing to do with your Hebrew. That has nothing to do with anything else. It's simply a matter of time. I don't know what the stamp is. I don't think it's has an official expiration date, but we can call ourselves that. We can also call ourselves an Oleh Vatik or an Olah Vatika, a veteran Jewish immigrant. Vatik is a great word, by the way, because it means veteran, and it's a nicer term to use for senior citizens. A Mevugar is simply an adult. A Vatik is a senior citizen, a nicer way to call someone who's older. Okay. Another way we define ourselves is where we live in the country. Some of us may live in an ir, and that has uh, what's the term? It has demographic realities. A city in Israel cannot be called officially an ir unless it has an X amount of population. Okay. You may live in a kvar, a village or a small town, or an old-fashioned term called ayara. Ayara comes from the word ir. We don't typically use the word ayara anymore. You'll hear it from older generations. Ayara has a little bit of a derogatory meaning. If you call where someone lives in ayara, it's sort of like a backwater town. It may actually not be, but you, by calling it that, are giving it this sort of low-level status. Best to use kval. Or in worst case scenario, you call it an ir, even if it doesn't meet the demographic standards and definition. A moshav and a kibbutz. Okay, a moshav and a kibbutz have actual definitions. You can't just call any small town in Israel a moshav or a kibbutz. That for sure you can't do. Any small town you can call a kfar. You can't call a moshav a kibbutz. Those have very standardized definitions as to how the settlement is administered. And there is an obvious definition difference, between moshav and kibbutz. I'm not going to get into now. The next one is an important word, yishuv. Yishuv simply means a settlement. Okay. Yishuv in Zionist history we talk about the old Yishuv versus the new Yishuv, HaYishuv HaYashan. The old Yishuv, the Jews who were living in the land of Israel before 1862. And the new Yishuv, HaYishuv HaChadash, the waves of Aliyah that came after that period. Yishuv nowadays can mean any settlement, any populated area in the land of Israel, but increasingly it only refers to those that are in the West Bank / Judea and Samaria, whatever you want to call it there. Increasingly, that's the term that's used, Yishuv. Okay, and know that the word Yishuv is either neutral in politics and ideology or in favor of. Okay. Other places, the way we define ourselves in Israel is by where geographically we live in the country. Do we live in Hamelkaz, the center, where the majority of Israelis live? Do we live in Hadarom, south, or Hatzafon, the north? Or do we define it as a periferia or ha'otef? People who live in the north or the south are typically referred to by people who live in the center as living in haperiferia. Periferia is the Hebrew transliteration for periphery. It's a not nice term. It means that you live far out, obviously with important contributions. And increasingly, after October 7th, we simply use the word ha'otef. Even though the term was always used in the immediate communities around the Gaza Strip in the south, Otef Azah, we always use we're increasingly using the term Otef Israel, right? Otef Israel referring to the south and the north as the communities that are Israel's borders, right? Otef means to envelop something. Matafa is an envelope. To la'atof is to envelop something. Okay. So you can already see the difference in terms that we're talking about here, right? Hamilkaz Darom Hatzafon is how we would define ourselves, maybe where someone else is without any judgment. But periferia and otef definitely come with judgment. And that's what we're talking about here when we talk about identity and community, right? Think about it in your own native language, in your own communities. There are words you would define yourselves by. There are words you would define others by. And there were words that you know when you use them, they're being hurtful, or they're being judgmental, or they're being insulting. That's what we're talking about here in this class, both sides of the coin. Now we're going to get into some specific demographics. Okay. When we look at Hamigzah Ha'aravi, the Arab sector, what are we talking about? Well, first off, we have this term Aravi. This is a unique term to Israeli society because this constitutes a lot of different people under the term quote unquote Aravi, right? Because Aravi we would simply translate as Arab, but it doesn't just mean that because you have to further define what that means. Is someone who's called Aravi, Nutzri, Muslimi? We didn't even get into, are they from an Ir or a Kfar, right? Or are they Bedouin? Are they Druzi? Even though we talked about Haida Druzi, they often get lumped within Amigzah Aravi. Are they Cherkessi? Great question, because Cherkessim, Circassians, are from the Caucasus Mountains. They're Muslim, but they're not Arab, right? Same as Druze. Druze are not Muslim. They're not Christian. They have their own religion. Do they identify as Arab? Great question. And then we have another term, Arami. Arami, Aramean, are Christians, indigenous Christians to the Middle East who predate the advent of Islam and the Arab invasions in the 7th century, do not call themselves Arab, and in the last few years have been granted status by the state of Israel to be listed as Arami. Why is this important? It used to be on your Teudat Zehut, on your national ID card, you have that slip of paper that's in there. It used to have your nationality, right? Because your nationality is also caught up with your ethnicity. And so it would say one of these things on it. That has been taken off. You know someone, however, is Jewish or not because their Jewish birth date will be on their birth certificate, on their Teudat Zehut. If you're not Jewish, there's no need for a Jewish date on there, right? But these terms have meaning because these terms also determine what school system you go to, who's marrying and divorcing and burying and birthing you. Nowadays, they don't have as much Those are the big differences they have. Obviously, some of these people get drafted automatically into the IDF. Some of them volunteer, only have to volunteer. But you see the complexity of identity we're getting to, and we're only talking about now 20% of the population. And you have to further define what that means, right? We didn't even get into the next part, Jews, right? Even though, Nahon, we have great songs, Kulanu Yehudim, Kulanu Yisraelim. We still define ourselves on a lot of different ways, not just by city, not just by where we live, but also things like, for example, is my background Ashkenazi? And within Ashkenazi, we also know there are many different variations of what it means to be Ashkenazi. Sfaradi, again, many different versions. Just like the catch-all term Mizrahi is really is a very artificial term because that unites people from Yemen and India and Iran and all sorts of other places that have no connection with regards to their Jewish communities, traditions, and so forth. But these are the three big terms we use when we talk about Jews. We also talk about Jews, Yehudim mi Brit HaMoatzot L'Shavar, right? Brit HaMoatzot is the Hebrew way to say the USSR. Brit, like Arzot Brit in the United States. Brit, a union or a covenant. Moatza is a council. Soviet means council in Russian. Brit HaMoatzot, the Union of Soviets. Former, right? Because not everyone's coming from Russia. They're coming from all the different republics. Ethiopia, obviously. And then finally, for a lot of people on this call, Anglo or Anglo-Saxon. I know it's ironic for many of us coming from all of our different backgrounds, whether we're Ashkenazi, Sfaradi, or Mizrahi, to be called Anglo-Saxons, because in our respective countries of origin, that is a very different um, family history and lineage. But here in Israel, it is a catch-all term for anyone who comes from a native Hebrew, a native English-speaking background. So if you're from North America, specifically Canada, the United States, obviously it has to be specific. The UK, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, anywhere where English is the majority language, you are automatically an Anglo or an Anglo-Saxon, as we say in Hebrew, Anglo or Anglo-Saxon. Okay, let's get into some other terms, how we define ourselves. If we're Jewish, right? Even if we're not Jewish, by the way, these terms are also used by other communities. For example, Haida Druzit, the Druze use these terms. Other will use these terms because these are more religious based, how we identify ourselves. Chiloni. Chiloni started off as a derogatory term. And it's not that people who are not observant will necessarily call themselves Chiloni. But that term is still understood by someone who is not practicing in an observant level. The vast majority of Israeli Jews, however, when you survey them, will say that they're Masorati. Masorati simply means traditional. That's all it means. What that means is up to everyone's own definition, but Masorati is the term we most hear. It simply means traditional. Dati, religious. It simply means religious. Dati Leumi is what we would call religious national. This is a large swath of the population here in other countries would be called Orthodox or modern Orthodox. In Hebrew, Dati Leumi. Why are they called Dati Leumi? The Leumi primarily refers to the fact that they serve in the army and they are a functioning part of everyday Israeli society. And the Haredi is what many people now call, rightfully so, Haredi, ultra-Orthodox. We don't use that term ultra-Orthodox so much in English anymore. We instead use the Hebrew word Haredi. Chared means trembling, fearful, right? The idea that this person is especially fearful or trembling of God, Haredi. Okay, within Haredi, there's a huge swath of diversity. I'm not going to get into all of it, but the big division between them is, are you Litai or Hasidi? That's the big difference. There's obviously much more, but we're already running out of time. Litai literally means Lithuanian. Lita in Hebrew is Lithuania. Litai are Haredim or not Hasidim. You can look this up on your own. I know this refers to those of you who know a little bit of Jewish history or want to look this up, the mitnagdim, or in Ashkenazi Hebrew, the misnagdim. Okay, versus in English we would say a chassid, but in Hebrew chasidi. Okay, differences. I let you look that up, but these are the terms we use in modern Hebrew. Okay, a few more, and then we're going to pause, teach you the words you should probably not use, and by you probably not, you should not, and then wrap it up with a little bit more of a positive term. Okay. We talked about migdal, also talk about nitiyah. So in English, also translated into Hebrew, straight or heterosexual, or the term that's increasingly used for LGBT, lahatab. Just like LGBT is the English acronym for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, same thing in Hebrew, lahatab, right? Standing for lesbit, homosexualit, trans, bi. Okay, this is the term that's generally preferred. Okay, now the next group of words, I didn't put it in a separate spreadsheet of words to never use because this depends on context. So again, deep breath, deep breath. We're going to get through these words together. They may be offensive, trigger warning to those who need a trigger warning, but they're not meant to be offensive so long as you understand the context in which they're being used. Okay. This first word is a hard word for many of us to swallow because in English, we understand it to be a bad word. In Hebrew, it doesn't have the same cultural baggage. You would not call someone this, but you use this word regularly because this word, for example, if your watch slows down, this is the verb you're going to use to describe that act of your watch slowing down. Are you going to call someone this? No. But we use this term on a regular basis in Hebrew to say that something is slowing down. In English, it's bad. In Hebrew, it makes a slight difference. Same thing with this word. This word used to be the word that everyone used to describe someone who was lahatabi. Now, this term is really only used between LGBT people or between a close friend or a family member of that person to talk about them. But that's the limit of it. The same thing with these two. We didn't get into politics because there's plenty of slurs, unfortunately, that we hurl at each other, and these are two of them. These two terms are not offensive in origin. Okay, they're not. If you can call yourself Yamani, or you can call yourself Smolani. That is a term when you say it about yourself, has no negative baggage, but they are often used as slurs when you say it to someone else, right? They are very much used as insults to each other when you call someone else that. Okay, with that, I have one last word on here we're going to come back to. I'm going to pause this. And this is the point where I'm also saying to my colleagues at Nefesh B'Nefesh, you're going to pause the recording here because we're not going to share the next few words on the recording. This is the part where these are very offensive words. Like I said, some of these are a generational gap. Older people may use these words and younger people may absolutely not. Some of these come from your own upbringing, words that you may hear and you grew up hearing and you didn't think there was a problem with and then realizing they are. And some of these you maybe just never heard of, but you knew about them somehow. I think it's important to teach you those words. Not saying for you to use them, but to at least recognize them is important. Okay. So with that, we're going to go through them. Hold on just a second. I need to open up that. Okay. Okay, as you say here at the top, I wrote very clearly, never use the words listed below. Strongly consider calling out someone who does use them. I'm at least telling you, from my perspective, my many years in Israel, my many years knowing Israelis of all backgrounds, we don't use these words. Whether you want to intervene when someone uses these words, that's up to you. But you should at least know they exist. You should know that they are hurtful. Okay. Um, and I'm going to go through them. I'm not necessarily going to say them out loud. You can read them. There's the transliteration. There's the dots and bars indicating vowel sounds, but I'm going to explain a little bit. This one, many people come after me. But Jay, this word is in the Bible and it doesn't mean anything. Listen to very carefully. In modern Israel, this word is incredibly offensive, and you only hear it from older Israelis who don't know any better. I'm sorry to put it so bluntly like that. This is an inappropriate word. And if you don't believe me, ask someone of Motza Ethiopic, someone of Ethiopian origin. Ask them what they think of this term. It is an offensive term. It doesn't have the cultural baggage of the N word in the United States, but it is that level of offense. Do not use this word. Similar, do not use this word ever. Okay? This word does have that baggage when it was used. Do not use this term. This term is from This is Hebrew coming from the Bible. You do not use this word referring to someone in modern Israel. Absolutely not. This word is from Yiddish. We do not use this term. This term comes from a famous adult performer in France who was trans and was very popular. And through its dissemination into larger society, and especially a very conservative Middle Eastern Mediterranean culture that is Israel, became a slur for someone who is transvestite, or someone a man who is stereotypically effeminate. This is an offensive word. Do not use this term. This is also an offensive term. This comes from Arabic slang for women's anatomy. We don't use this term. We don't use this term to women's anatomy unless it's as a curse word. And certainly we don't call a woman this. Other terms we don't use. These two refer to Arabs. We don't use these terms. Okay. This was a term that was used a lot when Israel had an issue of refugees and migrant workers coming through the Egyptian border or in various other means. And it's a term that's used as a slur for anyone who doesn't belong in Israel, whoever decides that. This is an older term for against the ultra-Orthodox. You don't hear it very often, either of these terms. And they've sort of lost their power as words. That doesn't mean we use them. And this is a term that's a very Israeli term. Even though the English, of course, is derogative and offensive. I heard this word once. And I didn't know it was so offensive. In Hebrew, know that this term is essentially the equivalent of the K word for Jews. It is that offensive to Israeli Jews to be called this. So stay away from this. I talked to you about the diminutive. Here's an example of how not to use it. And then finally, two words in this category before I get to ending this with a little bit more positivity, that for many years we thought were okay to use. And you'll still hear people use these, but increasingly we don't use these two terms. Okay, we don't use these. These are the equivalent of in the United States of calling someone of Italian American origin a Guido, or in the United Kingdom calling someone a Chev. We don't use these terms. They're not very productive. They are considered slurs at this point. You wouldn't, unless you're joking with friends and you're calling each other that, but to call a stranger one of these, not a good move. Okay, with that, I'm going to go back to our previous slide and share with you one last important word that we've talked about before, but is an important word to round this all out, because there's obviously many more words, unfortunately, that we use in Israeli society to insult each other, to blame each other for the country's problems, for all sorts of other things that may go wrong in our own lives and we project it onto others. And so there's a really important word we learned a couple months ago for Yom Ha'atzmaut, and I'm going to teach you again. And it's the word mamlachti. Mamlachti is a really important concept in Zionism. And as I wrote here, it's finding and preserving common ground among the diversity of the population's differing backgrounds and ideologies. This is to say, if something or someone is mamlachti, it means that they're able to bridge all of our differences, not blur them, not push one over the other, but to say, let's find common ground. And we've found common ground through certain things. Mamlachti is what I will call, if Zionism got us to the state of Israel, Mamlachti is the day after. What do we do with this state? It's all well and good to call yourself Zioni, a Zionist. Important, right? But the state of Israel is a done deal. It's a done fact. No matter what other people may say, no matter what anyone says, it's a done deal. It exists. It will continue to exist. Mamlachti is that to ensure it keeps going. And it's not just any other state, but it's a state based on our ideals, not just in Megillat Atzmaut, Declaration of Independence, but in our own thousands of years of values and ethics, right? Mamlachti is the word. So even though I taught you all these different ways to call oneself and one each other and ways not to call oneself and each other, we can also understand this word mamlachti as being really important in how do we envision ourselves in one society with all our differences, holding on to them, but also striving for something different, united and together. Mamlachti is that word. With that, I'm going to stop here. I'm only going to be able to answer a few questions because we're running out of time. First off, Toda Rabah, thank you all for joining. We're more than 300 participants live learning Hebrew from around the world. Not many other places can hold that together. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Next week's class is going to be on a much lighter topic, or perhaps not, depending on how much you like this topic, which is summertime in Israel. If you've never experienced summer in Israel, or this is your first time, um, how do we put this in a very Israeli humor way? You don't need war for it to be hot outside. And it is going to be hot outside. So we're going to talk about all the different ways to survive and thrive, by the way, summertime in Israel, from food to weather to clothing to activities, all the things that define summertime in Israel. And by the way, also things like dealing with your electricity bills, air conditioning, food, all the different things to survive and maybe save a little money at the same time. Okay, that's next week's class, same time, same place. I only have a chance to answer a few questions here in the Q&A. Otherwise, you're welcome to be in touch with us by email, like I said before, hebrew@nbn.org.il. When to use Americai versus Americani? Great question. We had a whole lesson about this before, and that's why I prompted it by saying we've covered this before. Please look at our previous lesson. I believe it's called Turning Nouns into Adjectives or Creating New Words. We go through a whole difference between what is Americai and versus Americani. Really quick answer, Americai is a person, Americani is a thing. Okay, Germania is a person, Germanit is a thing. Whole previous class on that. How often is Yaldonet used? It's a term of endearment to call someone a cute little girl. Yaldonet. It's in quite a lot of song lyrics. Yeah. Na, 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 na. Is migzal related to carrots? No, it does have the same root, right? Gezel means a carrot, but ligzol means to cut, right? So think of a sector as a cut out part of the larger society. That's where the term comes from. Is there a word for a non-Jewish immigrant? Yes, it's simply the word for immigrant, which you can look up in any dictionary. It's mehager. Hegira is the act of immigrating or emigrating, by the way. The same word in Hebrew for an immigrant is also an emigre, mehager. Kafri, when I was told this means countryside, right? Take the noun kfar, put a yod at the end, and it becomes countryside or country-yesh, right? Many of you will go to a bakery and you'll get lechem kafri. It doesn't mean countryside bread. It simply means it's usually whole wheat bread, or it's got cracked grains or nuts in it, meaning it's not refined. Um, term. Nope, kafri is an adjective. Great question. Um, what is a Jewish birthday? The Jewish day is the day you were born according to the Jewish calendar, right? Remember, Jewish calendar has its own date and time. Um, is there a suffix used to make things bigger? No. Great question. Other languages do. We don't have that in Hebrew. Can the chat be turned off? Yes, if you hover over the chat button, you'll see it says show chat previews. Unclick that. With that, Toda Rabah, thank you all for joining. As I said, you'll get a copy of this class and the spreadsheets in the next day or two. Next week, same time, same place, summertime in Israel. Until then, Toda Rabah and lehitrot. See you all very soon. Take care.